Usually when we talk about a scientific problem or like a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute precision.
Right, yeah, like it's engineering or something.
Exactly. Like you
Yeah.
fall off a bike, you break your arm, and the x-ray shows that jagged white line right on the screen, and the
Yeah.
doctor just points at it and says, there it is. That's the problem.
Broken or not broken. Very binary.
Right? It's a clean binary reality. But then you step into the world of human agency.
Oh, yeah, that's where it all falls apart.
Totally. You start looking at neurodevelopment, conscious deliberation, why we actually choose to do the things we do, and suddenly that X-ray machine is, it's utterly useless. We are looking at a landscape that is just profoundly murky.
It's a swamp.
It really is. And today we are wading right into the absolute deepest part of that swamp, so welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today for you listening is to crack open one of the most enduring, complex, and frankly maddening puzzles of human existence.
The big one. Free will.
Free will. And we aren't just skimming the surface here. We are drawing from an absolute behemoth of a source today. It's the monumental Oxford Handbook of Free Will, the second edition.
Edited by Robert Kane, yeah.
Right. And this is a massive collection. You've got the leading minds in philosophy, quantum physics, neuroscience, theology, all just colliding over this single question. So whether you are prepping for a high-level philosophy seminar or you're just intensely curious about whether you actually chose to hit play on this audio today, we're going to untangle this together.
And to even begin to grasp the scope of what we are dealing with here, we have to recognize that the free will problem isn't just one question, it's a hydra.
A hydra, yeah, I like that.
It is. In his introduction to the handbook, Kane brilliantly maps out how this debate touches 8 distinct, massive domains of human thought. It permeates everything.
8 domains. I actually want to unpack a few of those right now just so we can establish the sheer gravity of what's at stake here for you listening.
Yeah.
Because it's not just armchair philosophy, right?
Yeah, not at all.
Like, the first domain Kane mentions is moral agency and ethics.
Oh.
This is the bedrock of how we treat each other. It's about dignity, accountability, blameworthiness.
Right.
If somebody does something horrific or, on the flip side, if somebody does something incredibly heroic, our entire framework for saying they deserve to be punished or they deserve a medal relies entirely on the assumption that they authored that action.
Right. That is the foundation of moral desert. If free will is an illusion, then praising a philanthropist is logically equivalent to praising a particularly well-programmed Roomba for sweeping the floor.
Oh, wow. A Roomba. That's bleak.
It is. But it fundamentally hollows out our concept of human dignity, and that bleeds directly into the domains of social and political theory, and especially legal theory.
Oh, the criminal justice system.
Exactly. Our entire justice system hinges on criminal liability. We have different degrees of murder entirely based on the concept of intent and premeditation. We assume the person in the dock had a genuine choice to not pull the trigger.
Right. And then there's the psychology and psychiatry domain. Like, think about addiction or compulsion or even just ordinary weakness of will.
Dieting, trying to exercise, yeah.
Yeah. When someone is struggling to get sober, we talk about them fighting their demons, exercising self-control. But if free will doesn't exist, what exactly is fighting what?
It's just chemistry happening.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The handbook also goes into the philosophy of mind, rational choice theory in economics, theology.
It's huge, yeah. Reconciling human freedom with an all-knowing divine creator.
And general metaphysics,
Yeah.
which gets into the raw nature of time and chance.
So if you pull the thread of free will, you find that the entire tapestry of human civilization just starts to unravel. Every single way we construct society relies on this deeply held assumption that we are the captains of our own ships.
And that brings us to the core paradox. Because there is this fundamental, agonizing tension between our internal subjective experience and our external scientific models.
The inside versus the outside.
Right. On a personal level, we feel deeply that it is up to us. Think about your morning routine today. When you stood in the kitchen and deliberated between having tea or having coffee, you felt the weight of that choice, right?
Yeah.
You felt like the ultimate source of the action that followed.
But then the advent of determinism in science completely threatens this.
Totally. If the past, stretching all the way back billions of years to the Big Bang, combined with the unbreakable laws of nature, perfectly predicts the future, are you really free?
It feels like you're a character in a movie actively writing the script as you live it.
Yes.
But determinism insists that the script was printed, bound, and finalized before the solar system even formed.
It's wild. How do modern thinkers even begin to untangle a paradox that massive?
Well, modern debates pivot on two primary questions, and Kane outlines these as the foundational architecture of the entire field. Keeping these distinct is crucial for our navigation of this material today.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is the determinist question. Is determinism actually true? We have to figure out if the universe genuinely operates as a closed, perfectly predictable clockwork system.
Okay, and the second?
The second is the compatibility question. Can free will and determinism coexist? Hypothetically, even if we discover the universe is a rigid clockwork machine, is there a way to define human freedom that still operates legitimately within those grinding gears?
I actually want to tackle that determinist question first. To figure out if determinism is true, we can't just look inward. We have to look out at the physical universe. We have to look at the literal physics of freedom.
We do.
Because if the universe is just a giant machine, and we are physical beings constructed entirely of atoms, then we must be machines too.
Right. And for centuries, the smartest people on the planet believed the answer was an undeniable yes. We have to look at the 18th century for this, specifically at the French polymath Pierre-Simon Laplace.
Oh, Laplace's demon.
You got it. He proposed a thought experiment that basically became the terrifying gold standard for determinism. Laplace suggested we imagine a supreme intellect, a demon that possessed two impossible pieces of information.
Okay.
First, it knows the precise location and momentum of every single elementary particle in the entire universe at one specific frozen moment in time.
It's a perfect snapshot.
Perfect snapshot. Second, it perfectly comprehends all the forces and laws of nature acting upon those particles.
So it has the ultimate snapshot of the present and the ultimate rule book.
Exactly. And using Newton's laws of classical mechanics, Laplace argued that this intellect could calculate the entire past and the entire future with absolute certainty. For this demon, nothing is uncertain.
Everything is just math.
Yeah, the future is just as fixed and visible as the past. Physicist Robert Bishop actually breaks this down in his chapter, explaining that this Laplacian vision rests on specific features like differential dynamics and unique evolution.
What does that actually mean, practically?
What that means, practically, is that the mathematical equations of the universe work perfectly in both directions. If you know the state of the system now, there is only one logically possible path it could have taken to get here, and only one logically possible path it can take going forward. It's a universe of absolute value determinateness.
Wow. But, I mean, classical physics didn't get the final word, right? The 20th century rolled around, and the X-ray machine of classical physics got basically smashed to pieces by quantum mechanics.
Oh, completely. Werner Heisenberg completely shattered the Laplacian dream.
The uncertainty principle.
Exactly. With his uncertainty principle, he demonstrated that it is physically impossible to simultaneously know both the exact position and the exact momentum of a subatomic particle.
And this isn't just because our microscopes are bad, right?
No, not at all. It is not a flaw in our measuring equipment. It is a fundamental ontological feature of reality. At the lowest subatomic basement of the universe, things operate on probabilistic laws, not deterministic ones.
Which means Laplace's demon is blind at the microscopic level. If the demon looks at an electron, it can't know exactly where it is and where it's going. That seems like an unbelievable victory for free will. I mean, the clockwork is demonstrably broken.
It definitely pries the door open. David Hodgson explores the ramifications of this extensively in the Handbook. He isolates 3 specific features of quantum mechanics that seem almost tailor-made to rescue free will.
What are they?
First is pure indeterminism, the fact that prior conditions just do not guarantee a single outcome.
Okay, that makes sense.
Second is non-locality. This is the mind-bending phenomenon where particles can become entangled and seemingly affect each other instantaneously across vast distances.
Defying the classical limits of space and time.
Right. And third is observer participation.
Now, observer participation is the one that always sounds like science fiction to me. The idea that a quantum system exists in a fuzzy cloud of probabilities, a superposition, right?
Right.
Until a conscious observer actually measures it, forcing the wave function to collapse into a definite state.
It sounds like fiction, but it is deeply integrated into quantum theory. Hodgson looks at some truly provocative interpretations of this, particularly the work of mathematicians John Conway and Simon Kochen.
Okay.
They published something provocatively titled The Free Will Theorem.
Wait, a mathematical theorem proving free will? That sounds huge.
Their argument is highly technical, but it essentially states that if human experimenters possess even a tiny amount of genuine free will in choosing how they measure a quantum particle, then the mathematics dictate that the particles themselves must also possess a primitive elemental form of free will.
That is wild.
Meaning, the behavior of the particle is not completely determined by its past history. Now, Hodgson is intellectually honest here. He acknowledges that not all physicists accept this indeterministic view. Some try desperately to rescue determinism using alternative frameworks.
Right, like the many worlds interpretation,
Hmm.
which basically says the universe never actually chooses an outcome. Instead, every time a quantum probability arises, reality splits, and every possible outcome happens across an infinite number of branching parallel universes.
Exactly. Or David Bohm's hidden variables theory.
Oh, which suggests that the universe is actually deterministic, but the mechanisms driving the particles are just hidden beneath a layer of reality we can't access yet.
Right. But even if we reject many worlds and we accept the orthodox view that the quantum world is fundamentally random, we hit a massive scaling problem.
The macro scale.
Yeah, Robert Bishop tackles this in his chapter. The question is, does random subatomic jittering actually impact massive macroscopic human behavior? I mean, our brains are incredibly hot, wet, enormous objects compared to a single electron.
So the weirdness gets lost in the noise.
Typically, yes. In systems that large, all those tiny quantum weirdnesses just average out. They get swallowed by classical mechanics, rendering the brain predictable again.
And this is where Bishop brings in chaos theory, right? And nonlinear dynamics to bridge that gap between the micro and the macro. Because in a chaotic system, things don't average out.
Exactly. In highly complex nonlinear systems, incredibly minute fluctuations can be drastically amplified. This is the classic butterfly effect.
The butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil, sets off a tornado in Texas.
You got it. Bishop looks at the Nobel Prize-winning work of Ilya Prigogine on far-from-equilibrium systems. The suggestion is that biological organisms, particularly the incredibly dense, infinitely complex neural networks of the human brain, might be poised in a state of exquisite sensitivity to these micro-level indeterminacies.
Wow. Okay, but even if chaos theory allows a quantum spark to ignite a macroscopic brain state, we crash right into a massive philosophical wall here, because Bishop and Harold Apmey-Spector discuss a principle that honestly terrifies philosophers of mind.
The causal closure of physics.
Yes, Cop.
Right, so the causal closure of physics is a strict scientific thesis. It asserts that every physical event that has a cause has a completely sufficient physical cause.
Okay, so let's trace a neural pathway. Your arm moves. Why? Because a muscle contracted. Why? Because a motor neuron fired. Why? Because a specific cascade of neurotransmitters crossed a synapse, which happened because of a prior chemical reaction.
Stretching back into a continuous, unbroken chain of physics and chemistry.
Right, so where does my thought fit into that chain?
According to strict cop, it doesn't.
It doesn't.
No. If the physical chain is complete and sufficient on its own, then mental causation, the intuitive belief that your abstract, non-physical desire or thought caused the neuron to fire, is impossible. The physical world doesn't need your thoughts to operate. In this view, thoughts are just epiphenomena.
Okay, let me put an analogy to this, because this concept of epiphenomenalism is genuinely chilling. It's like the exhaust fumes coming out of the tailpipe of a car.
Okay, I like that.
Right. The engine is doing all the mechanical work, combusting fuel, driving the pistons, turning the wheels. The exhaust fumes are definitely produced by the engine. They hover around it. But the fumes themselves do absolutely zero work to propel the car forward.
They're just a byproduct.
Exactly. If our conscious thoughts are just exhaust fumes rising off the chemical engine of the brain, then everything we feel, every deliberation, every pang of guilt or burst of love is completely impotent.
It completely nullifies the self. To fight back against this, Bishop and Apmey-Spector propose a framework called contextual emergence. They argue that you cannot fully explain a complex system just by looking at its lowest level of physical parts. The lower level physics provides the necessary conditions, but you need the higher level macroscopic mental context to dictate how those parts actually behave.
Okay, I see the appeal of contextual emergence, but I keep coming back to a glaring vulnerability in this whole quantum escape hatch. I really struggle to see how this saves us.
How so?
Well, if a subatomic particle in my cortex swerves randomly due to quantum indeterminacy, and chaos theory amplifies that swerve so that I suddenly decide to, I don't know, propose marriage, that doesn't make me free. It just makes me twitchy. How is an entirely uncaused random event any better for human agency than strict determinism? If my life-altering choice was ultimately dictated by a random rule of cosmic dice at the quantum level, I wasn't the author of that choice. It just happened to me.
You are touching on the exact vulnerability that has plagued libertarian philosophers for millennia. It is often called the luck objection, or the mind argument, and its roots stretch all the way back to antiquity, to the Epicureans.
Wait, really? The Epicurean?
Yes, the Epicureans realized determinism was a threat, so they theorized that atoms occasionally experience an uncaused swerve,
Wow, ancient quantum theory.
basically. But critics immediately pointed out the same flaw you just did. If an event is truly undetermined, it is, by mathematical definition, out of the agent's control. It is a matter of luck. And we do not hold people morally or legally responsible for random spasms.
So looking at the physics leaves us trapped between two nightmares. We have macroscopic determinism that threatens to turn us into pre-programmed robots, and microscopic indeterminism that threatens to turn us into random, twitching slot machines.
Neither of which looks remotely like free will.
No.
And because the physics gets so messy and counterintuitive, a massive contingent of philosophers suggest a different approach. They say, let us temporarily set aside the microscopes and the chaos equations. Let us look purely at the formal logic of the situation.
Okay.
Let us assume, simply for the sake of argument, that Laplace was right and the universe is entirely, strictly deterministic. Does that assumption officially, logically annihilate free will?
Which brings us to the logic of powerlessness, right? The consequence argument. Because we assume determinism, the logical landscape looks incredibly bleak.
It is perhaps the most famous, robust, and heavily debated argument in late 20th century philosophy for incompatibilism.
And incompatibilism is the view that free will and determinism are fundamentally mutually exclusive, right?
Exactly. Peter van Inwagen popularized this in the 1970s and 80s, and Daniel Speake and Thomas Capitan spend their chapters in the Handbook dissecting it piece by piece.
I keep thinking about Peter van Inwagen's logic here,
Okay.
because it is deceptively simple and almost terrifyingly powerful. It seems like he's basically saying if determinism is true, then everything I am doing right this second is the direct consequence of the laws of nature and the state of the universe millions of years ago.
Right.
But I obviously had zero control over what was happening before I was born. And I obviously have zero control over the laws of physics. So if I can't control the past and I can't control the laws of nature, then I have absolutely no control over the consequences of those things, which means I have no control over my present actions. I mean, is it really that brutally simple?
It is that elegant and that brutal. To make it mathematically rigorous, van Inwagen introduced a formal logical operator that he called the beta principle.
The beta principle.
Yes. Daniel Speake's chapter explores the massive cottage industry of philosophy that has sprung up just to analyze beta. The beta principle is essentially about the transfer of powerlessness. It formalizes the idea that if you are completely powerless over condition X, and condition X absolutely necessitates event Y, then you are completely powerless over event Y.
Okay, let's use a physical analogy. Imagine a line of heavy dominoes. If I am physically powerless to stop the first domino from falling, and the laws of physics dictate that the first domino falling necessitates the second domino falling, I have absolute zero power over the second domino.
Exactly.
It's a transfer of powerlessness down the chain. So the Big Bang is the first domino, and my choice to drink coffee this morning is the final domino. The consequence argument says the powerlessness transfers all the way down the timeline to my kitchen.
That is the precise mechanism of the argument. And philosophers who desperately want to save compatibilism have spent decades launching highly technical attacks on the beta principle.
Looking for loopholes.
Exactly. Speake details these intense debates, mapping out the incredibly complex, often bizarre hypothetical scenarios philosophers invent to try and prove that beta might occasionally fail. They look for logical loopholes where powerlessness doesn't perfectly transfer. But despite decades of assault, for a vast number of thinkers, the consequence argument remains an impenetrable logical fortress.
But wait, in his chapter, Thomas Capitan looks at this fortress and basically says the walls are made of papier-mâché, right? He argues that this entire terrifying argument rests on a subtle linguistic trick.
He does. Capitan focuses his attack on what he calls practical modalities. He scrutinizes the exact language van Inwagen uses. The consequence argument relies extremely heavily on how we interpret every day. Common sense words like power, ability, and avoidability.
Words we use all the time.
Right. When the incompatibilist concludes, "It is not up to us," Capitan stops and asks, what exactly does the phrase "up to us" actually mean in reality? He argues that if we carefully practically define what it means for a human being to have the ability to do something, the consequence argument loses all of its terrifying teeth.
Okay, let's ground this in a real scenario. If I am deliberating between grabbing an apple or a donut, the consequence argument says the Big Bang already locked in my choice.
Right, you're going to pick the donut.
Probably, yeah. But I have a perfectly functioning brain. I am not paralyzed. I understand what an apple is, and I understand what a donut is. I have the physical and cognitive hardware required to pick up either object. Capitan seems to be saying that having that hardware is the ability. Even if the universe's timeline means I am guaranteed to pick the donut, it is absurd to say I didn't have the ability to pick the apple. I clearly had the ability, I just didn't exercise it.
You are articulating the exact pragmatic frustration that birthed the entire compatibilist movement. Compatibilists look at the consequence argument and conclude that incompatibilists are demanding a magical, physically impossible definition of freedom.
They're moving the goalposts.
In a way, yes. They argue that we can have a deterministic universe and we can possess a form of free will that is robust, meaningful, and actually worth wanting.
Ah, the compatibilists. They always strike me as the ultimate pragmatists of the philosophy world.
Hmm.
Bernard Borofsky's chapter traces the lineage of this view, which is called classical compatibilism, right?
Right.
It has heavy hitters behind it. Thomas Hobbes, David Hume, John Stuart Mill.
The classical compatibilist framework is incredibly straightforward. They define freedom merely as the absence of external constraint. Freedom is the power to do what you want to do without physical impediment.
Okay.
If you desire to walk out the front door and the door is not bolted shut and nobody has a gun to your head and you are not paralyzed, then you are free to leave.
But how do they deal with the classic requirement that to be truly free, I could have done otherwise? Because the incompatibilist will immediately yell, if determinism is true, you literally could not have done otherwise. There was only one possible future.
Classical compatibilists answer that objection by deploying what they call a conditional analysis. They argue that when a normal person says, I could have done otherwise, they are not making a profound metaphysical claim about alternating quantum timelines.
Right.
What they actually mean is a conditional statement. I would have done otherwise if I had desired to do otherwise.
Oh, wow. That is a very clever shift.
Isn't it?
Yeah. So I would have picked up the apple if my internal desire for the apple had outweighed my desire for the donut. And since nobody physically forced my hand toward the donut, I was acting freely. The fact that my desires were predetermined by my genetics and my stressful day just doesn't matter. I acted on my strongest desire without interference.
That is the core of classical compatibilism. Freedom is a behavioral phenomenon. But Borofsky is quick to point out that this classical conditional analysis starts to show severe structural cracks the moment we move past simple physical constraints and look at complex internal psychological realities.
Well, it seems like it completely collapses when you bring in things like severe phobias, compulsions, or serious clinical addiction.
Exactly.
Imagine someone with a profound heroin addiction. They have the drug sitting on the table in front of them. There are no external constraints. No one is forcing them. They take the drug. According to Hobbes or Hume, that person is the epitome of a free agent. They did exactly what they wanted to do without physical impediment.
But our modern clinical understanding of human psychology screams that this person is not free. They are profoundly unfree. They are a prisoner to their own neurochemistry.
Right.
They might desperately, agonizingly want to get clean. They might hate the drug. But the impulse overrides their higher reasoning, and they take it anyway. Classical compatibilism has no mechanism to explain why the addict is unfree because it just doesn't look inside the mind.
Which brings us to a massive upgrade in compatibilist theory. In 1971, the philosopher Harry Frankfurt revolutionized this entire school of thought.
He really did.
Michael McKenna explores this heavily in his chapter, focusing on what are known as mesh theories. Frankfurt essentially said that classical compatibilists were treating humans like simple animals. He noticed that human beings possess a unique cognitive architecture. We don't just experience blind desires. We have the capacity to critically evaluate our own desires. We can have desires about our desires.
Frankfurt categorized these into levels. A first-order desire is a basic foundational drive. I want to eat, I want to sleep, I want to consume this substance. Every sentient animal has first-order desires. But human beings possess the reflective capacity to form second-order desires. You can look at your first-order desire to sleep all day and form a higher-level evaluation. I want to be a productive person who does not want to sleep all day.
So in the case of the addict, the tragedy is a structural misalignment.
Yes.
The first-order desire is the overwhelming chemical drive. I want the heroin.
Mhm.
But their second-order desire, their reflective evaluation of their life is, I want to be a father who doesn't want heroin.
Frankfurt coined the term second-order volitions for these higher-level endorsements, and his resulting theory of free will is structurally beautiful. He argues that you have free will when your first-order desires perfectly align or mesh with your second-order volitions.
Ah, mesh theories.
Exactly. You are free when you are successfully moved to act by the desires that you actually want to be moved by. The addict lacks free will because their internal structure is fractured. Their action is driven by a first-order desire that is actively at war with their second-order volition.
So freedom isn't about defying the laws of physics or escaping determinism. Freedom is a state of internal psychological harmony. It's cognitive structural integrity.
It is a phenomenal shift in perspective, and McKenna highlights how other philosophers took Frankfurt's mesh concept and refined it further. Gary Watson, for example, argued that Frankfurt's levels of desire were too similar. Watson proposed that true freedom is a mesh between our motivational system, our raw desires, and our valuational system, our rational judgments about what is objectively good or worthwhile.
And Michael Bratman expanded this into the dimension of time, right?
Yes, Bratman introduced a planning theory. Humans are unique because we form complex, long-term policies and intentions for our lives. Bratman suggests our freedom is realized when our immediate short-term desires mesh seamlessly with our long-term, rational plans.
And the genius of all these mesh theories is that they're entirely comfortable in a deterministic universe.
Hmm.
I mean, every single part of my psychological structure, my genetics, my childhood environment, the socioeconomic factors that shape my values, my long-term plans, and my immediate desires could be 100% determined by the Big Bang. But as long as the gears inside my mind are meshing properly and aligning with my higher reflections, I have achieved the only kind of freedom that matters.
Christopher Taylor and Daniel Dennett lean into this heavily in their chapter. They argue that much of our terror regarding determinism comes from a primitive misunderstanding of what causation actually is.
Also,
They utilize the work of Judea Pearl, a pioneer in artificial intelligence and causal networks, to demonstrate that human beings operate like incredibly advanced, complex information processing machines.
okay, calling a human being a machine is usually the fastest way to get people to reject your philosophical theory. It sounds incredibly cold.
Dennett argues it shouldn't sound cold at all. It should inspire awe. Consider an incredibly advanced chess-playing computer, like Deep Blue or AlphaZero. The computer's programming is entirely deterministic. Yet, it exhibits behaviors that look remarkably like freedom.
Because it's so complex.
Right. It adapts, it learns from its environment. It evaluates millions of potential futures and creatively selects a novel strategy that its own programmers couldn't have predicted. Taylor and Dennett argue that human freedom is exactly this capacity for flexible, reflective, deeply informed, and creative action. The fact that the underlying physical machinery is churning deterministically doesn't negate the brilliant, adaptable software of the mind running on top of it.
Okay, let me try to synthesize this whole compatibilist approach.
Right.
The classical compatibilist looks at a dog chasing a squirrel
Yeah.
and says the dog is free because it's not on a leash. But Frankfurt, Watson, and Dennett look at a human and say, we are different. We can sit on the porch, watch the squirrel, and deeply reflect on whether we want to be the kind of person who spends our time chasing squirrels. We can evaluate our motivations. So for the compatibilist, free will is essentially highly evolved self-management. It is the capacity to steer our own ship using reason, even if the ocean currents and the wind were predetermined.
That is an excellent summary. For the compatibilist, the capacity for rational self-management is the freedom worth wanting.
But I know that for a huge portion of people listening right now, that conclusion feels deeply unsatisfying. It feels like a linguistic shell game.
It does to a lot of philosophers, too.
Yeah. Immanuel Kant brutally dismissed this compatibilist approach as a wretched subterfuge. William James famously called it a quagmire of evasion. It feels like we realized we couldn't win the fight against determinism, so we just changed the definition of freedom so we can hand out participation trophies.
That visceral dissatisfaction is exactly what propels us into Section 4 of the Handbook, the libertarian stand. Philosophical libertarians, which are completely distinct from the political ideology, by the way, they refuse to accept the watered-down compatibilist definition.
They want the real deal.
They plant their flag on two absolute demands. First, determinism must be false. True free will is radically incompatible with a predetermined universe. Second, we actually possess this radical free will. We are the ultimate, buck-stopping, uncaused sources of our own actions.
But remember the brick wall we hit when we looked at the physics. If an action is not determined, it is just random quantum luck. How do libertarians make sense of a freedom that is neither rigid clockwork nor a random twitch?
This is known as the intelligibility question. Can we even construct a logical model of libertarian free will that doesn't sound like magic? Randolph Clark's chapter does heavy lifting here, outlining three main philosophical pathways.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is agent causal theory, or AC. This is the most radical. AC posits that human beings are fundamentally unique substances in the universe. We possess a sui generis, a completely unique and irreducible kind of causal power. We can cause events to happen without being paused to do so by any prior physical events or psychological states.
So in the AC framework, we are essentially walking miracles.
Yeah.
We are little prime movers.
Yes. The second pathway is non-causal theory. This approach argues that our truly free actions are not caused by anything at all, not even by us as agents.
Wait, what?
Instead, they are simply explained by our internal reasons and purposes. The action spontaneously occurs, and our reasons provide the context.
Honestly, both of those options sound terrifyingly unscientific. They sound exactly like what the philosopher P.F. Strawson ridiculed as panicky metaphysics. If I am an uncaused cause, how do my actual memories, my personality, and my rational thoughts connect to my actions? If my beliefs don't cause my choices seem entirely untethered from who I actually am.
Clark himself acts as a skeptical guide here, pointing out those exact severe vulnerabilities in both the agent-causal and non-causal theories. They struggle deeply to integrate with a scientific view of the world. This forces us to look at the third and most prominent pathway, event-causal theory, or EC. And to understand this, we must dive into the deeply influential work of the Handbook's editor, Robert Kane.
Kane's centered event causal theory is massive in this space. He realizes he is to thread the needle between determinism and random luck, using only standard scientific ants.
Kane argues that the core of true free will is something he calls ultimate responsibility, or UR. It is not sufficient to simply have alternative possibilities in front of you. To be truly free, you must be the ultimate originator of your own will. You must be the author of your own character.
Okay.
But Kane makes a profoundly important, pragmatic concession. He admits that not every single choice we make needs to be radically indeterministically free.
Right. Like if I choose coffee over tea this morning, I don't need the universe to hang in the balance. My established character, my habits, my caffeine addiction, those pre-existing states deterministically drive that mundane choice, and that's perfectly fine.
Exactly. Kane agrees that the vast majority of our daily actions flow naturally and deterministically from the character and the will we have already formed. However, Kane argues there are critical, defining moments in our lives where our character is not yet fully set. Moments where our internal reasons are fiercely divided. He calls these moments self-forming actions, or SFAs.
Let's build a visceral scenario to understand an SFA.
Yeah.
Give me an example of someone standing that crucible.
Imagine a fiercely ambitious businesswoman. She is walking to a meeting that is guaranteed to secure her a massive promotion. It is the culmination of years of work. As she hurries down the street, she witnesses a violent assault in an alleyway.
Oh, wow. Okay.
She is thrown into a profound, tearing internal conflict. Her moral conscience, her empathy, screams at her to stop, intervene, and call the police. But her ambition, her drive for security and success, screams at her to keep walking, to look away, so she isn't late for the most important meeting of her life.
And crucially, both of those screaming desires are genuinely hers. She is not being coerced. She is torn between two valid parts of her own identity.
Yes, and here is the neurological hypothesis Kane introduces, bringing it back to the physics we discussed earlier. Kane proposes that during these intense moments of deep cognitive conflict, the brain actually enters a macroscopic state of chaotic, far from equilibrium processing.
Under dynamic noise.
Exactly. The competing neural networks, the morality network and the ambition network, are firing so intensely against each other that they literally create thermodynamic noise in the brain. This chaos amplifies the underlying quantum indeterminacy of the neurons.
So the brain's decision-making apparatus literally becomes unmoored from determinism in that specific moment.
Yes. The outcome of this struggle is genuinely, physically undetermined right up until the exact millisecond a decision is finally reached. It is not merely an epistemic limitation. It's not just that we don't know what she will do. The universe itself does not know. The future is physically unfixed.
She is essentially hovering in a state of macroscopic quantum superposition.
In a metaphorical sense, yes. And when she finally chooses, say she pushes through the temptation of ambition and chooses to stop and help the victim, she collapses that neurological chaos into a singular new reality. She resolves the tension.
Informs her character.
Exactly. In doing so, she does something incredible. She actively makes herself into the kind of person who prioritizes moral duty over professional success.
Laura Ekstrom and Thomas Pink spend time in the Handbook defending this kind of approach, arguing vehemently that this is not Mysterianism. This isn't invoking ghosts or souls. This is utilizing complex, chaotic neurobiology to discover a legitimate physical gap where true agency can operate.
They are actively fighting back against philosophers who claim free will must forever remain an insoluble mystery. They believe we can ground libertarian freedom in empirical reality.
Okay, but I have to push back here on behalf of the skeptical listener. Because while the SFA concept is incredibly cinematic, doesn't it run headfirst right back into the luck objection? Let's look closely at the businesswoman. If the choice between morality and ambition is truly, physically undetermined in her brain up to the very final millisecond, isn't her final choice basically just a coin flip happening inside her synapses?
It's a fair question.
Right. And if it's a thermodynamic coin flip, how on earth is she responsible for it? How can we praise her for being a hero if her heroism was the result of a lucky roll of the neural dice?
It is the sharpest, most devastating question for any event-causal libertarian, and Keynes' response to the luck objection is the bedrock of his theory. Keynes says, you have to look at the effort.
The effort.
Yes. No matter which way the neural coin lands, she will be acting on her own reasons and her own conscious effort. If the chaos resolves and she stops to help, she did it because she actively willed to do the moral thing. She had strong reasons to do it. If the chaos resolves and she walks away, she did it because she actively willed to advance her career. She had strong reasons for that, too.
So it's not a random spasm that happens to her while she's passively watching.
Taking that a step further, it is the result of her own agonizing, conscious effort to resolve a profound conflict between two competing sets of her own deeply held values. Whichever pathway the brain collapses into, it is a pathway she was actively trying to bring about. Therefore, whichever choice wins, she actively takes ownership of it.
She endorses the outcome. It's not a coin flipping in a vacuum. It's a coin flipping inside a pressurized crucible of her own conscious deliberation and effort.
That is the ultimate defense. She bears ultimate responsibility because she voluntarily initiated and sustained the conflict that led to the character-forming resolution.
It is a stunningly intricate theory. It rescues human dignity without abandoning science. But what if Keynes' neurological gamble is just wrong? What if neuroscience ultimately proves that there is no thermodynamic, chaotic noise creating gaps in our neural pathways? What if the brain is just a wet computer, determinism is 100% true, and the compatibilist redefinition of freedom is just a wretched subterfuge?
If that is the case, then we leave the comfort of these theories and we enter the abyss. We move to Section 5, the skeptics, illusionists, and revisionists.
The Harding compatibilists.
Yes. They look at the messy physics, they look at the logic, they reject the compatibilist compromises, and they draw the most chilling conclusion possible. Free will simply does not exist.
Dirk Pereboom is the absolute heavyweight in this arena. His arguments are terrifyingly persuasive.
Pereboom's chapter rigorously defends his Harding compatibilism. He believes libertarian free will is scientifically implausible, and he sets out to utterly demolish compatibilism using his famous four-case manipulation argument.
This argument is an absolute mind-bender. Walk us through the four cases because they force you to confront your deepest intuitions.
Pereboom asks you to imagine a man named Professor Plum. Plum decides to murder a colleague named White for personal, selfish gain.
Okay, classic murder mystery setup.
Exactly. In Case 1, Plum is being remotely controlled by a team of evil neuroscientists. They are pushing buttons on a supercomputer that sends radio signals directly into Plum's brain, forcing him to experience the desire to murder White and forcing his body to act on it. Now, does Plum have moral responsibility? Is he blameworthy?
Obviously not. He is a literal meat puppet. The neuroscientists are the murderers. The weapon just happens to be Plum's body.
Right, every philosopher agrees on Case 1. So Pereboom moves to Case 2. In Case 2, there are no remote controls in real time. Instead, the neuroscientists programmed Plum's brain at birth. They wired his neural pathways so that, inevitably, based on his programming, he would develop the overwhelming desire to murder White at this exact moment in his life, and his internal reasoning would rationalize the act. Is he responsible?
It's slightly more removed, but still no. He was pre-programmed. His internal reasoning was entirely authored by someone else. He's just a complex wind-up toy fulfilling its design.
Now, case 3. There are no evil neuroscientists at all. But Plum grew up in a severely abusive environment. He was subjected to intense, relentless societal conditioning and psychological trauma that deterministically guaranteed he would develop the specific psychological profile of a murderer and inevitably choose to kill White.
This is where it gets uncomfortably close to reality. We see this in the justice system all the time. But logically, if it was mathematically guaranteed by his childhood trauma he didn't choose, it feels profoundly unjust to hold him ultimately blameworthy in a cosmic sense.
Yeah.
He is a victim of circumstance.
Finally, we arrive at case 4. Plum is just a normal guy living in a normal, deterministic universe. There are no neuroscientists and no extraordinary childhood abuse, but because the universe is deterministic, the exact state of the universe at the Big Bang, combined with the laws of physics, guaranteed that the atoms in Plum's brain would form in such a way that he would inevitably desire and choose to murder White.
Oh, man.
Boom delivers the knockout blow. He argues there is absolutely no logical or moral difference between case 1 and case 4.
Wait, really?
In all 4 cases, Plum's decision was ultimately caused by factors completely outside of his control. If determinism is true, we are all just manipulated by the blind universe. Therefore, the compatibilist claim that Plum is free in case 4 just because his internal desires meshed is absurd. Compatibilism fails, and no one is fundamentally morally responsible for their actions.
That is a devastating conclusion. If no one is to blame for anything, does the entire justice system just evaporate? Do we just empty the prisons and let society collapse into anarchy?
Boom insists society wouldn't collapse. He argues that life still retains deep, profound meaning without free will. We can still experience love, joy, and sorrow. As for the justice system, he proposes a radical shift. We can still lock up dangerous criminals, but not to punish them. We lock them up based on a quarantine model.
A quarantine model.
Yeah, if someone has a highly contagious, deadly virus, they aren't evil, but we still quarantine them to protect society. Criminals are just broken machines. We should contain them for public safety, but our entire focus must shift from violent retribution to humane containment, rehabilitation, and addressing the systemic causes that broke the machine in the first place.
It sounds incredibly compassionate and peaceful, but deeply unsettling. It requires abandoning the concept of justice as we know it. But Saul Smolanski looks at this exact same abyss and takes an even darker, more cynical turn.
Smolanski's contribution is fascinating. He advocates for a position called fundamental dualism combined with illusionism. He completely agrees with Boom on the facts. He agrees libertarian free will is impossible, and he agrees determinism destroys any true, ultimate moral desert. But Smolanski issues a dire warning. If we actually broadcasted this truth to the general public, if we convinced the average person that free will is a myth, it would result in absolute societal catastrophe.
Why? If we adopted Boom's quarantine model, wouldn't we just be a kinder society?
Smolanski doesn't believe human psychology can handle it. He argues that without the deep-seated belief in ultimate responsibility, people would lose their fundamental sense of self-respect. They would lose the primary motivation to do the difficult moral thing. The fabric of interpersonal relationships, which rely on genuine gratitude and genuine resentment, would disintegrate. Therefore, Smolanski reaches a staggering conclusion. We need the illusion of free will. It is a necessary, vital fiction. To maintain moral order and human sanity, society must actively cultivate and protect this illusion.
So, Smolanski is essentially arguing that society is a delicate matrix and we must never unplug the public. We had to be hard determinists when we are analyzing the physics in a philosophy seminar, but we must act like devout compatibilists when we walk out onto the streets. That feels incredibly condescending. Can a human society truly function optimally if its entire justice system, our entire concept of praise, blame, and personal achievement is based on an acknowledged, deliberate lie held by the intellectual elite?
It is a bitter, elitist pill to swallow, which is why Manuel Vargas steps in with a completely different rescue operation: revisionism. Vargas argues that we don't need to lie to anyone, and we don't need to abandon the concept of free will, we just need to mature. He points out that when science progresses, we often discover our initial folk intuitions about the world were wrong.
Like realizing the Earth isn't the center of the universe?
Exactly. Or Vargas uses the analogy of water. For millennia, humanity's folk concept of water was that it was a pure, indivisible, fundamental element. Then modern chemistry discovered that water is actually a compound, H2O. When we made that discovery, we didn't throw our hands up, declare that water doesn't exist, and start calling it an illusion. We simply updated our definition. We revised the concept to align with scientific reality.
So we do the same with free will.
Right. Vargas says we must do the exact same thing with free will. The magical, uncaused, libertarian folk concept is dead. So, we revise our understanding of free will and moral responsibility to be something scientifically accurate, likely a sophisticated form of compatibilist self-regulation, and we move forward.
Speaking of aligning with scientific reality, let's get out of the philosophical armchair. We've spent a lot of time debating logic, beta principles, and hypothetical neuroscientists. I want to look at the actual wet physical brain. The Handbook dedicates a massive section to the actual laboratory science. What does modern neuroscience and experimental psychology actually observe when a human being makes a choice?
This is where the theoretical debate hits the cold, hard, empirical data. Alfred Mele's chapter is crucial here, as it directly confronts the most infamous, disruptive experiments in the history of free will research. The 1980 studies conducted by neuroscientist Benjamin Libet.
These are the legendary experiments that the media always points to, claiming science proves free will is a lie. Okay.
That was certainly the popular headline. Libet designed a fascinating experiment. He hooked human subjects up to an electroencephalogram, an EEG, to continuously monitor the electrical activity in their brains. He gave them a very simple task: flex your wrist. They could flex it whenever they wanted, completely randomly. But they had to watch a specialized, rapidly sweeping clock face and note the exact millisecond they became consciously aware of the internal urge or decision to move their wrists.
Okay, so we are tracking three things: the physical movement, the conscious realization of the choice, and the underlying brain electricity.
Here is the data Libet captured. The EEG detected a steady buildup of electrical activity in the motor cortex, a phenomenon known as a readiness potential. This readiness potential began, on average, 550 milliseconds before the subject's wrist actually moved.
Half a second.
But here is the shocker. The subjects consistently reported that they only became consciously aware of the urge to move about 200 milliseconds before the movement.
Wait, let me do the math on that. So the brain's motor cortex started firing and preparing for the action a full 350 milliseconds before the person consciously decided to do it.
You've hit the exact finding that sent shockwaves through the scientific community. The unconscious brain seemingly started the engine and put the car in gear long before the conscious mind even turned the key. Prominent psychologists like Daniel Wegner seized on this data. They argued it was empirical proof that conscious will is a total illusion. The unconscious neural machinery makes all the decisions in the dark, and then, a fraction of a second later, the brain sends a notification to your conscious mind, tricking you into believing you authored the choice.
That is the ultimate existential nightmare. It brings us right back to that terrifying feeling of being a helpless passenger locked inside your own skull, watching your body do things and just taking the credit for it.
But Alfred Mele dedicates his work to meticulously pushing back against this catastrophic interpretation. He argues that Libet, and especially psychologists like Wegner, are wildly conflating a few distinct neurological concepts. Mele insists that an electrical readiness potential is not the same thing as a firm, irreversible, conscious decision. It is merely an urge. It is a preparation. It is the building of neural tension.
It's not pulling the trigger, it's just putting your finger on the trigger.
Exactly the right framing. You can experience a strong urge to do something and still consciously veto it. And here is the irony. Libet's own experimental data actually supports this. Libet ran variations where subjects were told to prepare to flex, but then stop themselves at the last second. He found that even after the readiness potential began ramping up, the conscious mind had a 100-millisecond window where it could intervene and cancel the movement. Mele argues that this veto power, which is sometimes cheekily referred to as free won't, rescues conscious agency.
So the unconscious brain is constantly bubbling up options, urges, and readiness potentials. But the conscious mind sits at the top of the hierarchy, acting as the final gatekeeper. It can say yes or no before the signal hits the muscles.
That is the defense. However, Henrik Walter's chapter throws a significant bucket of cold water on our reverence for the conscious mind. He dives into the murky waters of social psychology and the bizarre clinical reality of split-brain patients. Walter argues that our conscious mind is incredibly arrogant and astonishingly bad at knowing why we actually do things.
Tell me about the split-brain patients, because that always feels like peering into the Matrix.
In patients who have had the corpus callosum severed, meaning the left and right hemispheres of the brain can no longer communicate with each other, researchers can run fascinating tests. The left hemisphere controls speech, while the right hemisphere is largely mute. Researchers can flash a written command, like stand up, exclusively to the patient's right hemisphere. The right brain processes it, and the patient stands up.
because the motor command works.
Right. But then the researcher asks the patient speaking to the verbal left hemisphere, why did you just stand up? The left brain literally does not know. It didn't see the command. But it doesn't admit ignorance. It doesn't say, I don't know. Almost instantaneously, the left brain fabricates a completely plausible, rational reason. Oh, I needed to stretch my legs, or I was going to get a glass of water.
It just invents a narrative to explain the body's behavior. It confabulates.
Yes. And Walter points out that normal, neurologically intact people do this constantly. The field of social psychology is overflowing with rigorous experiments demonstrating that our choices are heavily dictated by subtle environmental cues that we are entirely unconscious of. The temperature of the room, a faint smell in the air, the ambient noise, the subtle phrasing of a question, these things dictate our behavior. Yet when researchers ask us why we made a choice, we confidently, instantly invent a conscious, rational narrative. Walter argues we are essentially PR agents for our unconscious brains, constantly spinning coherent stories to justify decisions our chemistry made in the dark.
Okay, this feels like a barrage of knockout punches to our everyday sense of self. Between Libet's readiness potentials and Walter's confabulating PR agents, if our unconscious chemistry is doing all the actual heavy lifting, and our conscious mind is just a deluded storyteller taking credit after the fact, what is even left of human freedom? Why do ordinary people even care about this debate if the science is so damning?
This profound disconnect is exactly what birthed a fascinating new movement called experimental philosophy, or XPhi. The Handbook features the work of Eddie Namias, along with pioneers like Joshua Knobe and Sean Nichols. They realized that for centuries, philosophers have been sitting in armchairs arguing about what ordinary people implicitly believe about free will. Namias decided to stop guessing and actually go survey the public.
Applying the scientific method to philosophy, what did the surveys reveal?
The results were genuinely shocking to the academic establishment. Namias discovered that ordinary people do not actually find determinism to be a significant threat to free will.
Wait, really? The entire premise of the hard incompatibilist, the whole reason Per Boom and Van Inwagen are terrified, the general public just doesn't care about it.
Namias argues the data is clear. When you present average people with a strictly deterministic scenario, say a science fiction universe where a supercomputer perfectly predicts every human action from birth to death based on physical laws, people read the scenario and overwhelmingly respond that the humans inside that universe still possess free will and should still be held morally responsible for their crimes.
Then what does threaten them? Because people clearly experience existential dread around this topic. What is the public actually afraid of losing?
The survey data reveals they are terrified of a concept Namias labels bypassing. Bypassing is the horrifying idea that your conscious thoughts, your agonizing rational deliberations, your deeply held beliefs, and your earnest desires are just impotent passengers. It is the fear that your actions are driven entirely by subpersonal chemical gears, and your conscious self is totally bypassed in the causal chain.
That perfectly locks into what we were saying earlier. It is the fear of being the exhaust fumes. It's like finding out that the steering wheel in your car isn't actually connected to the front axle, and you've just been furiously turning it left and right, pretending you were driving while the car drives itself autonomously. Namias is suggesting that ordinary people are actually perfectly fine with the car following a pre-programmed deterministic route laid out by the Big Bang, as long as they know the steering wheel is actually connected, as long as their conscious reasoning is the legitimate physical mechanism making the car turn.
That is a brilliant synthesis. People are fundamentally okay with being caused. They are terrified of being bypassed.
That distinction alone changes the entire landscape of how we process this debate.
And that profound insight brings us to the end of our monumental deep dive into the Oxford Handbook.
Let's try to corral all of this. Let's summarize the immense journey we just took, because we have covered centuries of thought.
We began by watching physics wrestle with the ghost of determinism. We saw the terrifying rigid clockwork of Laplace's demon get dismantled by the probabilistic weirdness of quantum mechanics, only to realize that chaos theory and the causal closure of physics might just trap us in a different kind of cage. We analyzed the unyielding, frigid logic of Van Inwagen's consequence argument, exploring the terrifying possibility that our powerlessness over the Big Bang transfers directly down the timeline to paralyze our present choices.
Then we explored the great escape of the compatibilists. We saw them abandon the physics to locate freedom within the internal architecture of the mind, culminating in Frankfurt's beautiful mesh theory of first and second order desires, where freedom is the harmony of wanting what you want to want.
We examined the fierce resistance of the libertarians, specifically Robert Caine. We saw his demand for ultimate responsibility, locating true human freedom in those chaotic, thermodynamically undetermined crucibles of moral struggle, self-forming actions that forge the very iron of our character.
We stared straight into the abyss with skeptics like Paraboom, who argued via his four cases that free will is a myth and justice must become a quarantine. We recoiled from illusionists like Smolansky, who argued society can only survive on a noble lie, and found solace in revisionists like Vargas, who simply want to update the dictionary.
And finally, we confronted the raw data of the laboratory. We weathered the storm of Libet's readiness potentials, found hope in Melee's veto power, grappled with Walter's confabulating split brains, and arrived at Namias's revelation that our true fear is not determinism, but the terrifying prospect of being bypassed.
So, to you listening to this, what is the ultimate takeaway? The beauty of a source this comprehensive is that you do not have to immediately pledge allegiance to one camp. You don't have to get a compatibilist tattoo or sign a libertarian manifesto today. Just understanding the contours of this massive landscape shortcuts your way to being profoundly well-informed on what is arguably humanity's deepest question. But if there's a unifying takeaway here, it is that free will might not be what we thought it was. It might not be a magical, uncaused spark. It might not be the power of a ghostly prime mover defying physics. Instead, it might simply be a measure of integration. Free will is the degree to which your conscious, rational reflection actively physically shapes your future. It is the desperate, vital, daily work of ensuring your rationality isn't bypassed by your impulses. It is the effort of gripping the steering wheel so tightly that your knuckles turn white, proving that even if the road is already laid out, you are the one driving the car.
I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as you go about the rest of your determined or undetermined day. It builds directly on that idea of the steering wheel. I want you to reconsider the boundaries of your own identity. When we feel existentially threatened by neuroscience or genetics or the Big Bang, it is almost always because we are drawing an incredibly tiny circle around our conscious awareness and labeling only that tiny circle me. And because we do that, we view everything else, our unconscious brain processing, our genetic inheritance, our neurochemistry, our childhood development, as alien forces. We view them as foreign invaders outside the circle, pulling our strings. If you define yourself that narrowly, then of course you have no free will. You are a helpless victim of your own biology.
The ultimate puppet, terrified of its own strings.
But what happens if you expand the circle? What if you radically accept that your subconscious processing, your deeply wired habits, the trauma and triumphs of your history, and the chaotic thermodynamic noise sparking in your cortex are not alien invaders? They are all valid, essential, integral components of who you are. If your entire brain, the conscious spotlight, and the vast, dark, churning, unconscious ocean beneath it is the self, then perhaps your brain isn't pulling your strings. Perhaps your brain is you, freely pulling the strings of the universe, collapsing probabilities into reality, one messy, integrated choice at a time.
It's like waking up and realizing you aren't just the helpless actor forced to read the pre-printed movie script. You are the actor, yes, but you are also the screenwriter. You are the director. You are the lens of the camera, and you are the celluloid film itself. And when you look back at that X-ray from the beginning and you see the muddy, chaotic, unreadable waters of the human mind, maybe that is not the image of a broken machine. Maybe that is exactly what a living, breathing, choosing human soul actually looks like. What stands out to you?